Okay, so you've probably noticed something interesting, maybe a bit odd, about news broadcasts lately, haven't you?
Uh-huh.
Specifically, those date and time stamps.
Hmm.
They don't seem to pop up quite as much, or maybe they're less obvious than they used to be,
Yeah,
especially, it seems, on cable news.
it's definitely a thing. A really sharp observation, actually. And it kicks off a pretty interesting question, about how news gets made and how we watch it now.
Exactly. And that observation is why you shared these sources with us, right?
Mm-hmm.
Asking that big question. Is this shift deliberate?
Mm-hmm.
Is there some like strategic play here? Maybe even, as some people wonder, something like social engineering going
Oh,
on.
here, yeah. Or is it maybe simpler? Just, practical stuff driving this change on our screens.
That's the puzzle.
Yeah.
That's what we want to dig into here.
Yeah.
The sources you gave us, they really look at both sides, this idea of a grand plan versus just the everyday grind of the news business.
Mm.
So our mission for this deep dive is to take these sources you sent over,
Yeah.
unpack what they're saying about why those timestamps might be fading a bit,
Yeah.
and figure out, according to these sources, how that might change the way you actually take in the news. So let's jump in. What's the material telling us?
Okay, let's get into it. So the sources, they definitely acknowledge that first thought you had, that this could be some kind of deliberate manipulation, maybe that social engineering idea.
Right. It's an understandable first reaction.
It is. But they pivot pretty quickly. They argue that, yeah, it's possible, but the evidence in the material seems to point much more strongly towards what they call more common and practical reasons.
Practical reasons.
Okay.
And these seem really tied into just how news works today, doesn't it? Especially that nonstop 24/7 news cycle we're all used to.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating, according to these sources, is how just needing to constantly fill airtime shapes these little production choices.
Right.
Like, say you produce a segment, it might still be totally relevant a few hours later, maybe even the next day.
Sure. But if it has this big, obvious date and timestamp right on it when you replay it, well, it instantly flags it as old news.
Ah, right. Which immediately makes it feel less urgent, maybe less breaking, even if the info is still good.
Exactly.
So from the network's point of view, constantly showing old timestamps
Yeah,
could kind of undermine that feeling of immediacy they want across the board.
precisely. And the sources connect this straight to the idea of evergreen content. Not all news just vanishes.
Right, like explainer pieces or background reports.
Or even some interviews. They might stay relevant for a while. So taking away those really explicit timestamps lets networks, as the sources suggest, get more use out of these pieces. They can re-air them without them immediately screaming, old news.
Okay, so there's a definite efficiency angle there, an economic one too, based on the material. What about the huge shift in how we even get our news? Everything moving online.
That's a really important point. The sources bring up the whole digital distribution side of things.
Well, think about it. When you're watching news, maybe via streaming or on demand or just on a news website,
Mm.
you're not really locked into that linear broadcast moment anymore.
True.
And websites, apps, they usually provide metadata, that background info, like when it was published or uploaded. It's right there with the article or the video.
Okay. So when information is still there, just maybe not burned onto the video itself all the time. It's moved like from the visual layer to the data layer online.
Exactly. The sources basically suggest that as more and more viewing happens online, the need for that constant on-screen timestamp maybe becomes less critical because the platform itself gives you that context in the metadata.
That makes sense. Just a technical evolution, really. What else do the sources mention? Any other factors?
Yeah, a couple more. Screen real estate and just, well, aesthetics.
Oh, yeah.
News channels already cram a ton of stuff onto the screen, right? Tickers, headlines, network logos, those text banners at the bottom.
They can get incredibly cluttered, yeah.
So adding another constant, really prominent date and timestamp just eats up valuable space. It sounds like, according to these sources, networks are making design choices about what's absolutely essential to show all the time.
And the timestamp is kind of losing that fight?
It seems that way sometimes. It's competing with other elements for that limited space.
Okay.
And finally, the sources mention something maybe simpler, just streamlining the production workflow.
How so?
Well, not having a graphic element that needs constant, super precise updating for every single segment, every replay,
Yeah.
it could just make things a little easier behind the scenes, maybe a minor factor compared to the others, but potentially part of the mix.
Got it. So, okay, let's recap the practical side.
Right.
While that initial, maybe more dramatic idea of, strategic social engineering is floating around,
Right.
The sources you shared really push back on that, emphasizing these, well, more mundane drivers.
Yeah, pretty much.
Things like the demands of 247 broadcasting, the usefulness of evergreen content, the big shift to digital where metadata does some of the work, plus just limited screen space and maybe making production a tiny bit simpler. That's the picture the sources paint for why this might be happening.
That's what they present as the core reasons, yeah.
Yeah.
But, and this is important, the material also makes it really clear that these practical decisions can have pretty significant side effects, maybe unintended ones even, on how we perceive the information.
Okay, so here's the twist the sources get into. It's not necessarily about the intent behind removing the timestamps,
Right.
but more about the impact these practical choices have on us, the viewers. What kind of effects are we talking about?
Well, one key thing the sources point out is that without that constant timestamp, older footage or reports can sometimes be presented in a way that, well, feels more current than it is. This could potentially contribute to this sort of continuous feeling of urgency or like a crisis is always happening right now, even if the specific piece of information is from hours or even days ago.
Wow, okay. That really changes how you experience the news, doesn't it? The pace, the relevance of what you're seeing right then.
It absolutely can. And the sources also mention how, the lack of that precise on-screen timing might subtly make it a bit harder for viewers to easily track how a story is evolving, especially a fast-moving one.
You mean comparing reports from different specific times?
Yeah, exactly. It might be harder to pinpoint, okay, this was the situation at 2 p.m., but by 4 p.m. this had changed.
So the overall story might seem consistent, but it becomes trickier for you, the viewer, to see those minute-by-minute or hour-by-hour shifts as things develop.
That's what the sources seem to suggest. It can make the whole flow of information feel maybe smoother, but potentially hides the timeline of how it actually unfolded.
Interesting.
And one last point on this. While that metadata exists online, the sources argue that the immediate visual timestamp you used to see on a live broadcast, it provided this direct, undeniable marker of when something was said or shown.
Right there on the screen.
Yeah. And its absence on screen might subtly affect the immediate sort of on-the-fly accountability. Tying a specific statement to a specific moment in broadcast time becomes less direct.
Okay, so the sources are drawing a pretty clear line here. They're saying the reasons for fewer timestamps are mostly practical business technology.
That's the main thrust, yeah.
But the effects, how timely the news feels to you, how easy it is to track its changes, that immediate accountability aspect, those effects can be quite significant for you as a viewer.
Exactly. It's all about the impact of the change, even if the change wasn't necessarily designed to create those specific impacts.
Now, it's important to note, the sources are also careful to say that news organizations haven't just, completely ditched telling us when things are happening, even on TV.
No, not at all. The material definitely notes that for stuff that is genuinely happening live right now, you almost always see that distinct live bug up on the screen.
Right, that's still very common.
And, when something major happens right now, those big breaking news banners still take over the screen. That hasn't gone away. Plus, as the sources remind us, anchors and reporters themselves still often give verbal cues, right? They'll say things like, earlier today, or this happened yesterday, or they'll mention specific dates and times within the report.
Yeah, those verbal cues are important context.
And like we talked about, the online versions, they almost always have explicit publication times, update times, that kind of thing in the metadata that goes with the story or video.
Okay.
So the information about timeliness is still being provided. It's just maybe through a mix of different methods now and not necessarily relying on that constant, always there on-screen timestamp that perhaps we remember being more common before.
Right. So this whole deep dive, really guided by the sources you brought in, has helped connect the dots from that initial observation you had.
Hopefully.
And while that first thought might have naturally jumped to some kind of strategic intent, maybe even manipulation, the material you provided points pretty strongly towards a mix of really practical economic and technological decisions being the main drivers for seeing fewer of those date and timestamps right on the screen.
Things like the 247 cycle, reusing content efficiently, the whole shift to digital platforms where metadata plays a bigger role.
Right. Plus screen design choices, maybe some workflow streamlining.
Yeah.
That seems to be the core explanation offered in this material.
That's the argument presented, yes.
But, and this is the crucial part, the sources highlight the perceptual impact of these practical changes is undeniable. How it can affect your sense of urgency when watching.
Yeah.
How it might subtly influence how easily you track a story as it changes over time.
Mm.
And even that subtle shift in the immediate on-screen link between a statement and the exact moment it was broadcast.
And it's good to remember, as the sources confirm, that other signals are still used. Those live bugs, breaking news banners, the verbal cues from reporters, and definitely the online metadata. They haven't vanished entirely.
Absolutely. So wrapping this up, here's maybe a final thought for you to mull over, sparked by these sources. Given that these seemingly practical decisions by news outlets do appear to have these significant side effects on how we perceive timeliness and context, what steps might you, as a news consumer, take to make sure you always feel like you have the full context, especially when you're getting news from all sorts of different platforms these days?